All right, so here we are back for our second review video on the muscular tissue. Everyone's favorite topic, how muscles contract. Are you shaking your head no? Probably, but that's okay. You don't have to like it, but I want you to do well on our next exam. So please, please, please review this because I'm going to be asking questions using the same terminology and the same steps that I'm introducing it to you now and in class. All right, so now that you know the anatomy, we're going to next talk about how the pieces of the muscle work together to contract. And as we go through this, I'm going to open up another little document here, and we're going to write the steps in order. Just one little document as a review. So here we go. We're going to call it the sliding filament theory. And you're not going to throw your notes against the wall because this is going to give you one list to study from. And then when you have the exam and you do well, you're going to be smiling. And all the work that you're going to be putting in will have paid off. And better yet, when you go on to your future studies, nursing school or whatever, you're going to do well. That's the important thing. Okay. So as we talked about in lecture, the very first thing that has to happen is a muscle needs a nerve impulse to come into it. And when that nerve comes down towards the muscle, it's going to reach the neuromuscular junction, which, as the name suggests, is the junction between the nerve and the muscle. So here we see it, right? A nerve impulse is going to come down the nerve from your brain. And then at the end of the nerve, we have these little tendrils that wrap down around the muscle fibers. And the junction of where they meet is called the neuromuscular junction. When we magnify it, of course, we remember that whenever a nerve reaches someplace else in the body, a muscle or organ, there is a space or a synapse. So we have to talk about how does that nerve impulse get from the muscle from the nerve across the muscle, across the synapse and into the muscle. How about I cannot talk this morning? Don't worry, because I've broken it down into steps. You're going to hate the steps, right? So what's going to happen is step number 1, the nerve impulse comes down the nerve and reaches neuromuscular junction. So if I go back to my list here, we're going to incorporate all of these as step number 1. So, nerve impulse how do I want to say this to make it as easy as possible? Nerve impulse reaches muscle. Look at that. Nerve impulse reaches muscle. But now we've got to get that nerve impulse across the synapse. So, step number 2 is going to be that once that nerve impulse comes down to the neuromuscular junction, that's going to trigger calcium to come into the nerve. So once that nerve impulse gets really close to the muscle, that nerve impulse will trigger calcium to diffuse into the nerve. So, nerve impulse reaches muscle. Calcium diffuses into nerve. Perfect. Well, what's going to happen next? Step number 3. What color can I use? Let's use blue. Step number 3 is that once calcium comes in, it will trigger the neurotransmitter from this vesicle to be released across the synapse. So once calcium comes in, these neurotransmitters that are usually housed in the vesicle, they're usually just chilling in the vesicle, but in the presence of calcium, that neurotransmitter, which is acetylcholine, will be released and will cross the synapse. So we go back here. Calcium diffuses into the nerve. Calcium causes acetylcholine, which we're going to abbreviate as ACH. Acetylcholine, which is our neurotransmitter, released. And then next, that acetylcholine crosses synapse into muscle. Okay, so the nerve impulse reaches close to the muscle. It's not really the muscle, but reaches close to muscle. So nerve impulse reaches very close to the muscle. Calcium diffuses into the nerve, which then causes a release of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine then crosses the synapse into the muscle. I made a funny little D there. Let's correct that. All right? So all those steps are what's happening at the neuromuscular junction. Nerve impulse comes towards the end of the nerve. Then, when that nerve impulse is present, calcium diffuses into the nerve, which then causes a release of acetylcholine. And it is acetylcholine that crosses the synapse into the muscle. So now what we've done is we've transferred the nerve impulse from the nerve into the muscle. So all these steps together, transfer nerve impulse into muscle. Nothing's easy in physiology, right? So we couldn't just have one simple step. We need 4 sub-steps to it. All right, so now the nerve impulse has crossed the synapse and it's reached the muscle. And there's another view if you want to see that. And I mentioned this in lecture. It is at this point that there is a brief pause. A latent period or latency period is just a fancy way of saying a brief pause in time. So if I go back here, this is where we have a brief pause. And the reason we have that is to give the structures of the muscle a chance to get themselves together and prepared for the remaining steps of muscle contraction. All right, now we get into the muscle. So we've already talked about step number 1. That's how the nerve impulse comes down to the neuromuscular junction. Calcium comes in, acetylcholine is released. Acetylcholine crosses the synapse into the muscle. Well, the next thing that happens, so we've already done step number 1 here. That's kind of hard to read, isn't it? Let's make it easier for you to read. We've already done step number 1, folks. Now, step number 2 is that nerve impulse, now that it's in the muscle, travels deep into the muscle. And where does that nerve impulse go? The sarcoplasmic reticulum. And remember, AP is just a shortened way of saying action potential, which is the same thing as nerve impulse. All right, so now we're in the muscle. All right, okay. Nerve impulse. I have a hard time with the R and the V. I don't know why. I think I just want to rush it. There we go. Nerve impulse. Travels deep into muscle to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Good. So we have the nerve impulse into the muscle. Now it's going to travel deeper into the muscle to the SR. That was step number 2. Once that nerve impulse reaches the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to release calcium. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum is going to release calcium. Remember, the sarcoplasmic reticulum, its job is to store calcium, but when it gets a nerve impulse stimulating it, it will release calcium. Step number 4, all those little calcium dudes and dudettes are going to travel deeper into the muscle, and they're going to travel to actin to expose the active sites. So that calcium is going to travel deep to actin, will bind to actin to expose its active sites. Okay, so step number 4. Calcium binds to subunits on actin, which results in exposure of active sites. So the calcium that is released from the SR travels deeper into the muscle, binds to the subunits on actin, which exposes the active sites. Now remember I said more specifically, it is that the calcium binds to the yellow troponin, which then rotates the tropomyosin, these orange things, out of the way. You don't need to be that specific, but we do need to know that calcium travels deeper into the muscle, binds to the subunits on actin to expose the active sites. Remember, in this picture here, the active sites are exposed. We see these little olive pit looking things. In this picture up here, the active sites are not open. Okay, so calcium comes down, binds to the subunits on actin to expose the active sites. Step number 5 is cross-bridging. The myosin head attaches to the active sites on actin. So step 5 is cross-bridging. Which means that myosin heads bind to active sites on actin. There's no movement yet. This is just the attachment. Okay? So remember, I was using my hands in lecture. At rest, the actin and myosin, even though they're close to each other, they're not touching. We need all the successive steps to happen, like a series of dominoes. Nerve impulse comes to the muscle. Calcium comes in. Acetylcholine release across the synapse into the muscle. Pause. Nerve impulse then travels deep into the muscle to the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The SR will then release calcium. Calcium then binds to a subunit on actin to expose its active sites. Only when all those previous steps have been done can we have cross-bridging. The myosin heads attach themselves to the active sites on actin. So we can see the attachment right there. Next, we have the power stroke. Step number 6 is the power stroke. Now, the myosin head will release its stored energy, which causes the myosin head to pivot, and this is when actin and myosin slide together. So, step number 6, power stroke. Myosin head releases stored energy, resulting in myosin sliding past actin. This is when the muscle shortens, folks. After the cross bridge, after the myosin head attaches to actin, then the myosin head will release stored energy, causing the myosin to pivot, and this is where the myofilaments slide together. This is when we have contraction. So we have the cross bridge, the power stroke, but then just as quickly as we had myosin attached to actin and then release energy and pivot, we have release. The myosin head gets pulled off of actin. Step number 7. Myosin head released from actin. Okay, excuse me, my nose is running, allergies. So we have the cross bridge, the power stroke, and then the release. So the cross bridge, myosin head attaches to actin. Power stroke, myosin head releases stored energy, and there is a sliding. And then myosin head gets pulled off of actin. This is where I said, as long as there's still nerve impulses coming down, we're still going to have a release of calcium. And steps 5, 6, and 7 will repeat. Okay? So here we have steps 5, 6, and 7 repeat as long as nerve impulses continue to come. So cross bridge, power stroke, release. Cross bridge, power stroke, release. Cross bridge, power stroke, release. Which means that with every successive cycle, the actin and myosin get closer and closer together. Good. Now, when there's no longer nerve impulses, when there's no more nerve impulses, the myofilaments will return to their original resting position. Which means that they return to their resting position, not attached, a little bit far away from each other. Also, also, the SR will reclaim calcium to store it for next time. So when there's no longer any more nerve impulses coming in, actin and myosin will be released, and the myofilaments will return to their original resting position, and the SR will pick up any of that calcium to store for next time. All right, folks, I hope this helped. As you have questions, please ask. Good luck.